A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Picture a young man in his mid-20s named Luo Huazhong. It is April 2021, and he is lying on a bed in a small, sparsely furnished room in Sichuan province. He has no full-time job, he is not looking for a promotion, and he is certainly not participating in the frantic, soul-crushing hustle of the Chinese tech scene. He picks up his phone and posts a photo of himself lying perfectly still on his bed to a Baidu Tieba message board. He attaches a simple manifesto titled, "Lying Flat is Justice." In it, he describes a life of minimal consumption, eating only 2 meals a day, and maintaining zero stress. He rejects the idea that he needs to be a productive cog in a machine that gives nothing back. He calls himself a traveler, someone who has stepped off the treadmill entirely. That single post ignited a firestorm that the Chinese government is still trying to put out 5 years later. Today's prompt from Daniel is about that movement, Tang Ping, or lying flat, and how it intersects with the brutal 996 work culture. This isn't just a story about China, though. It feels like a preview of a global collapse in the belief that hard work actually pays off anymore.
It is the ultimate passive-aggressive protest, corn. My name is Herman Poppleberry, and I have been obsessed with the data coming out of this movement because it challenges every assumption we have about economic growth and social stability. When we talk about 996, for those who might have missed the headlines a few years back, we are talking about a work schedule that runs from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. That is a 72-hour work week. For decades, this was the engine of the Chinese economic miracle. It was the price people were willing to pay to transform a developing nation into a global superpower in a single generation. But as we sit here in March of 2026, the wheels are coming off. The engine is overheating, and the mechanics, the workers, are simply walking away from the machine.
I remember when Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, famously called 996 a huge blessing for young workers back in 2019. He basically said, if you do not do it when you are young, when can you ever do it? He framed it as this patriotic duty, a rite of passage to build the nation and secure your own future. It was the ultimate expression of the Chinese dream. But now, you have an entire generation looking at the math and realizing the blessing was actually a predatory loan they can never repay.
The math is exactly what changed everything. In the early 2000s, if you worked those brutal hours in a city like Shenzhen or Hangzhou, there was a light at the end of the tunnel. You could actually buy an apartment. You could start a family. There was a clear, visible path to the middle class. Today, that path is blocked by a mountain of debt and impossible prices. The ratio of home prices to annual income in Beijing or Shanghai is often over 40 to 1. To put that in perspective for our listeners in the West, in most major American cities, a ratio of 8 to 1 is considered a catastrophic housing crisis. When the reward for 72 hours of labor a week is a rented bunk bed in a shared room and a diet of instant noodles, lying flat becomes the only rational economic choice. It is a refusal to participate in a zero-sum game.
So Tang Ping is not just being lazy, it is a strike, right? It is a labor strike where you do not even bother to pick up the picket sign or stand on a street corner. You just stay on the couch. You reduce your needs until the system can no longer leverage your desires against you.
That is a perfect way to put it. It is a refusal to compete in a game where the rules are rigged. The Chinese have a specific word for this that has become just as popular as Tang Ping, and that is neizhuan, or involution. It is a term borrowed from anthropology that describes a process where a social system reaches a point of diminishing returns. Think of a theater where everyone stands up to see the screen better. Eventually, everyone is standing, no one can see any better than they did when they were sitting, but now everyone's legs hurt and everyone is exhausted. That is 996. Everyone is working harder, staying later, and sacrificing more just to stay in the same place. It is growth without progress. It is friction without forward motion.
And the state reaction was fascinating and, frankly, a bit terrifying. You would think a few thousand people deciding to work less wouldn't be a national security threat, but the Chinese Communist Party went into full damage control almost immediately. By June of 2021, they had banned the Tongping hashtag. They scrubbed Luo Huazhong's manifesto from the internet. They even started promoting a counter-narrative about the struggle spirit. They released propaganda videos showing young people working in fields or factories, with big smiles, talking about the dignity of labor. Why does the government get so terrified of people wanting to take a nap?
Because the entire legitimacy of an authoritarian regime often rests on a single unspoken promise: we give you prosperity, and you give us your freedom and your silence. It is a performance-based contract. If the prosperity part of that deal evaporates, if the youth feel like they are being ground into dust for a dream they will never own, the social contract is void. Lying flat is a rejection of the state's core ideology of national rejuvenation. It is a form of non-violent resistance that is incredibly hard to police. You can arrest a protester in the street, but how do you arrest a million people for not wanting to buy a car? How do you prosecute someone for not wanting to get married or have children? You cannot force someone to have ambition at the end of a baton.
It makes me wonder about the global parallels. We saw the quiet quitting trend in the United States around 2022, which felt like a Western dialect of Tongping. People were doing the bare minimum required by their job descriptions because they realized their salaries were being eaten by inflation while their bosses were buying third homes. But it feels like the Chinese version is more profound because it is a total lifestyle shift, not just a workplace boundary.
There is a direct lineage there, and it is spreading. If you look at South Korea, they have the Sampo generation. Sampo means giving up three things: courtship, marriage, and children. That has since evolved into the N-Po generation, where N is a variable representing an infinite number of things being given up, including home ownership and even hope itself. In Japan, they have the Satori generation, the enlightened ones, who have essentially reached a state where they no longer desire material goods or career advancement. They saw their parents burn out during the lost decades of the Japanese economy, and they said, "No thank you." We are seeing a synchronized global realization among Gen Z and millennials that the meritocratic ladder has been pulled up and the rungs have been greased.
We talked about this a bit in episode 1167 when we looked at the AI productivity paradox. We have these incredible tools that should be making our lives easier, but instead they just raise the baseline for what counts as a standard workday. If AI makes you 20% more efficient, your boss does not give you Friday off. They just give you 20% more work. It feels like we are all living in a version of 996 now, just with better apps and more comfortable chairs. In 2026, the AI agents are doing the grunt work, but the humans are still expected to be on call 24/7 to supervise them.
The AI component is crucial because it accelerates the decoupling of effort and reward. In a traditional industrial economy, if you were the hardest worker in the factory, you might eventually become the foreman. There was a linear relationship between sweat and status. In an algorithmic economy, the gains from your increased productivity are captured almost entirely by the owners of the hardware and the software. The worker becomes a disposable input, a data point to be optimized. This is why the Tongping sentiment is so dangerous to the status quo. It is an intuitive grasp of the fact that the old incentives are broken. If the algorithm is going to take the surplus value anyway, why provide the surplus?
I want to dig into that paradox Daniel mentioned in the prompt. This movement started in China, a place with massive censorship and state control. Yet, they were the ones who gave it a name and a philosophy. Meanwhile, in the West, we have all this freedom of speech, but we seem to be, as Daniel put it, asleep at the wheel. We are complaining about our jobs on TikTok, but we are still buying the products, still taking the loans, and still participating in the hustle. Why did the Chinese workers find their voice on this before we did?
It is a classic case of pressure creating diamonds. In China, the pressure of 996 is so overt and so brutal that you cannot ignore it. It is literally written on the walls of the tech hubs. There is no pretense. In the West, Our version of exploitation is often more subtle and psychological. It is masked by the gig economy, which we discussed in episode 1161. We frame overwork as entrepreneurship. We call it the side hustle. We tell ourselves we are our own bosses while we drive for an app that takes a 30% cut and provides no benefits. We are distracted by the illusion of agency. We think we are choosing to work 14 hours a day because we are building a personal brand. The Chinese worker knows exactly who they are working for, and they know they are being exploited. That clarity makes resistance easier to conceptualize.
So we are essentially being gaslit by our own freedom. We think because we can tweet about how much we hate our jobs, we are somehow more empowered than the person lying flat in a dorm room in Chengdu. But that person has actually stopped the gears of the machine, whereas we're just lubricating the gears with our complaints.
There is also the factor of the safety net or the lack thereof. In many democratic nations, we still have the ghost of a social safety net, or at least the memory of one that keeps us from reaching that absolute breaking point. But in China, the lack of a robust social safety net means that if you fall behind, you fall very hard. There is no floor. When the stakes are that high and you still decide to lie flat, it is a much more profound statement. It is a total abandonment of the system because the system has already abandoned you. It is a form of existential bravery.
It is almost like the authoritarian nature of the society made the contradiction impossible to ignore. If the state tells you every day that you are part of a glorious national rejuvenation, but you are sleeping in a cubicle and can't afford a dentist, the lie becomes visible. In a democracy, we have so many competing narratives and cultural distractions, politics, celebrity culture, the next big tech trend, that we can convince ourselves the problem is just our own lack of discipline or a temporary economic downturn. We internalize the failure. The Tang Ping movement externalizes it. They are saying, the failure is not mine, it is yours.
I think we also have to look at the role of the family. In China, the pressure to succeed is not just personal, it is a multi-generational project. Because of the former one-child policy, you are often an only child carrying the expectations of 2 parents and 4 grandparents. They call it the 4-2-1 problem. When a young person in that position chooses to lie flat, they are not just rejecting a job, they are rejecting a massive familial burden. They are saying, I cannot be the retirement plan for 6 people. That takes a specific kind of despair to reach, but once you reach it, you are liberated from the weight of those expectations.
You know, what strikes me is that the conservative worldview usually champions the meritocracy. We want to believe that if you provide value and work hard, you will rise. But if the market is no longer rewarding that effort because of structural issues, like housing monopolies or algorithmic exploitation, then the truly conservative position should actually be one of radical reform, shouldn't it? We can't defend a system that doesn't actually work the way it claims to. If the ladder is broken, telling people to climb harder is just cruel.
That is the core of the tension. If we believe in the dignity of work, we have to ensure that work actually provides a dignified life. When it stops doing that, people will naturally look for an exit. The Tang Ping movement is a warning sign. It is a signal that the feedback loop between effort and reward is broken. If we don't fix that loop, we are going to see more of this apathy, not just in China, but everywhere. We are seeing it in the declining birth rates across the developed world. People are lying flat biologically by refusing to bring children into a system they don't believe in.
It is funny because the government tries to frame lying flat as a moral failing. They call it being decadent or lazy. But from an economic perspective, it is a very efficient response. If the cost of competing, the stress, the health problems, the lost time exceeds the potential reward of a tiny apartment 40 years from now, the only way to win is not to play. It is basic game theory. It is the Nash equilibrium of the exhausted.
And that is why the state is so scared. You cannot force people to be ambitious. You can force them to show up to a factory, but you cannot force them to innovate, to take risks, or to build the future. An economy powered by people who are just lying flat is an economy that has no future. It stagnates. It becomes brittle. The Chinese government is trying to pivot to something they call common prosperity to address this, trying to rein in the tech giants and lower the cost of living, but it might be too little, too late. The psychological break has already happened.
So where does this go? Is Tangping still the dominant vibe, or has it evolved into something else as we move through 2026?
The term itself is suppressed, but the sentiment has evolved into something even darker. Now they talk about Bailon, which translates to let it rot. If Tongping was about finding peace in minimalism, Bailon is about actively embracing the decline. It is saying, if the house is going to burn down anyway, I might as well enjoy the warmth of the fire. It is a form of nihilism that is much harder to co-opt than simple minimalism. When people stop caring if the system succeeds or fails, that is when a society becomes truly unstable.
It reminds me of the discussion we had about reclaiming the nap in episode 1160. We were talking about it as a productivity tool, a way to recharge for the next task. But in this context, a nap is a revolutionary act. It is reclaiming a piece of your life from a system that wants every second of your cognitive output. It is a micro-level resistance.
We should probably look at what this means for us practically. Because while we might not be living under an official 996 mandate in the West, the pressure to be constantly available, constantly productive, and constantly growing is very real. Our phones have turned our entire lives into a potential workspace.
The first takeaway for me is that we have to stop misreading apathy as laziness. If you see a whole generation checking out, don't look at their character, look at the scoreboard. If the scoreboard says that no matter how many points you score, you still lose, why would you keep playing? We need to have an honest conversation about social mobility and whether the paths that worked for our parents still exist. If they don't, we need to build new ones rather than shaming people for not climbing a broken ladder.
I would add that we need to audit our own relationship with the hustle. We are often our own worst 996 taskmasters. We have internalized the idea that if we are not working, we are failing. Reclaiming your time and setting boundaries is not just about work-life balance. It is about maintaining your agency as a human being rather than a data point for an AI to optimize. We need to move beyond productivity per hour as the sole measure of human value.
And for the policymakers and business leaders who listen to this, the message is clear. The social contract is not a suggestion. It is the foundation of a stable society. If you break the link between hard work and a better life, you shouldn't be surprised when people stop working hard. You can't demand the struggle spirit from people who have nothing to struggle for. You can't build a national rejuvenation on the backs of people who can't afford to buy a home in the nation they're supposedly rejuvenating.
I wonder if lying flat is a permanent state or just a waiting room. Are people waiting for a new movement, a new economic model, or are they just done? Is this the end of the work harder era?
I think it is a pause. It is a moment of collective reflection. The question is, what comes after the pause? Do we find a way to make work meaningful and rewarding again, or do we just watch the rot spread? It is a choice we are making every day in how we structure our companies and our cities. We are essentially tracking the end of an era where growth was the only metric that mattered. The next era is going to have to be about living better, not just producing more.
It is a heavy topic, but an important one. We are seeing the birth of a new kind of consciousness. It is quiet, it is still, and it is lying on its back looking at the ceiling.
Well, if you are listening to this while lying flat on your couch, don't feel guilty. You might just be the most rational person in the room. You might be ahead of the curve.
Or maybe you're just getting some much-needed rest before the next shift in the global economy. Either way, the nap is earned.
We should probably wrap this up before we get accused of inciting a global strike. Thanks for the deep dive, Herman. This gave me a lot to think about regarding how we frame success and what we are willing to sacrifice for it.
It was a pleasure, Korn. There is so much more to dig into with these global economic shifts, but I think we hit the core of the disillusionment today.
Big thanks to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes, and a huge thank you to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show and allow us to dive into these complex topics.
If you found this discussion valuable, please consider leaving us a review on your favorite podcast app. It really helps other people find the show and join the conversation about these weird prompts.
You can also find us at myweirdprompts.com for our full archive of over 1,100 episodes. This has been My Weird Prompts. We will see you next time.
Take care.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from Oslo takes two facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the flows from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My weird prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep